So what triggers the anxiety? Driven Mofos, welcome back to another episode of The Underestimated Entrepreneur. Okay, so we are doing Q&A. These are where community members on my Instagram page have asked me questions, and these are my answers to those questions. So let's get into question number 3. So this one here is sent in from Tay. Tay's one of our community members. So he says, what causes anxiety? Why do people get anxiety? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about anxiety. Now, anytime I talk about things like anxiety or depression or anything like that, we have to remember a couple of different rules. First of all, there is always exceptions to the rules. There is always people who have different theories and different ideas. Some of them are wacko, some of them are on point, and others you've just got to test things. Because every one of us is a unique individual. So not 100% of everything works for every person every time in most cases. Some things, yes, but in most not. Hence why you can have all these different diets and some work for some people and some don't. So when we talk about anxiety, I want to say that a lot of the statements that I'm giving are just generalized statements. They're ideas. They're things that I have found have worked, not just for myself, but for when I'm working with other people, and I've worked with tens of thousands of people. These are a bunch of different thoughts, bunch of different theories, and a bunch of different solutions that you can try if you do have anxiety or you do get anxious every now and again. Some people might not even call it anxiety. They might just call it stress. Some people call it pressure. Some people just call it over-energetic. Some people call it hyperactive. There's lots of different terms in the way that people describe it. So anyway, let's get into it. So first of all, to try to understand what anxiety is, first of all, it's a feeling or an emotion. Now that feeling, when we look at it, always gets triggered from a perception. So our perceptions of the world or our view of the world, they essentially trigger the emotional state. So based on all of my research, and I talk in depth about this at my Thrive Time event, we have a perception. The perception triggers these charges in the brain that perceive things as either good or bad, right or wrong, challenge or support, strength or weakness. We start to split these things, these ideas. Those ideas, depending on their intensity and severity and for how long they've been going, depends on how we feel. What will happen is those perceptions have to mean something. So when we feel a certain way, humans naturally look for a story. So they'll have a story about their past, they'll have a story about their future, or they have a story which has a meaning attached to it in relationship to why they feel the way that they feel. And that's why people describe things normally through stories or through meaning. From there, I believe, and this is my belief from doing a lot of research, when we have an out of balance perception, I believe that we create stories and meanings to try to understand things. From those stories and those meanings, they trigger the emotional states, and those emotional states then wake us up to how we're perceiving the world. So if you're stressed out all the time, it's not the external thing that is making you stressed. The external thing is a trigger for your mental and emotional imbalances. And so because of that, then people say, well, I feel stressed. Anxiety is the same. It's a response or a feeling to an out of balance perception. So then, let's talk about those perceptions. When we have any type of fear response, we tend to feel them in different ways. I'm going to bounce around a little bit here, but when we go back to something called Maslow's hierarchy, Maslow talks about this idea. Now, he was a famous psychologist. He talks about this idea of, at the top, self-actualization, which is the way that you can live the best life. Then as you drop down, you have this, I guess you could say, a survival response. So when a person has any sort of trigger that is a survival response, we tend to feel a certain way in a negative or a disempowered way. And it's telling us that we're trapped in a survival response. Sometimes that's important because when we're in a survival mode, we act and react a different way because we're surviving. Now, most of the population live in survival mode, even though they're not in survival. And that's also the reason why people don't self-actualize. I was talking about this last night on my Dominate program. So Dominate's like $47 US a month. And I have a coaching call every week, every Monday night with the people on that call. And we were talking about self-actualization. I said, that's the reason why I create all of my products and programs, is because my goal is to get people out of survival mode into self-actualization. Because when you self-actualize, you don't work for money. Money works for you. You don't build relationships to get something from other people or to feel safe. You build those relationships because you love the people that you hang out with. It's just awesome. Like, life is better because of the people you hang out with. When you're in survival mode, the people that you hang out with tend to have destructive patterns and behaviors and stop you from growing. If you look at everything in your life, it's either in self-actualization or it's probably in survival mode or somewhere in between. Now, depending on the amount of time you spend in survival mode, which is fear-driven, stress-driven, worry, concern, the fear of not having enough, the fear of not being enough, the fear of loss, worrying about what's going to happen in the future, worrying about the past, feeling guilty, feeling ashamed, all of those negative emotional states or disempowered emotional states are essentially a fear-based response. So we want to get out of that. And if we want to live a more empowered life, then we need to be more inspired. We need to stay more empowered. We need to have greater energy, greater self-awareness, which is the reason why I say that personal development is the greatest path to living an amazing life. That's why I love what I do. Because here, if you're listening to this podcast, you're essentially helping yourself to self-actualize if you're listening to the information and then taking action to improve your life. If you do that for long enough, what will happen is you'll get to a point where it's almost like one day everything just clicks and you just live life completely different. That's why most people do not understand when I say, I don't really care about money, because if people take my money or I lose everything, I'll just build it all back up because I have the most important things. Number one, I have courage, I have determination, I have the knowledge to grow, and I have all of the traits that are needed to live a great life. So people can take away all this physical shit, it doesn't matter because I have everything that I need. I'll just go back and build it again. This is why millionaires and billionaires can go bankrupt and then make it all again in 6, 12, 24 months, depending on how much money they've lost. Whereas if you give a broke person money who's living in fear, they tend to fuck it all up, which is why most people who win the cross lotto just destroy everything again. And not only do they destroy the money, they destroy things like their family, their relationships, their friendships, their health. They just become destructive because everything amplifies. So now, anxiety. Anxiety is a fear survival-based response for some reason. Now, then the question as a coach, I sit there and I look at that and I go, okay, what are they trying to survive from? How are they thinking? Let's go back up to their perceptions. What are the stories that they keep telling themselves? What are the meanings that they attach to things? And then also, what's their consistent mental and emotional state they're in? Now, when someone wakes up in the morning, the alarm goes off, scares the shit out of them. Then they're like, oh, crap, I'm awake, I gotta go to work. Bang, they already put themselves into a survival response. Because the word got to implies that you're trapped or essentially a slave. So if you've got to go to work, you're now a slave to money. Is that a self-actualization, I'm going to live the best life that I possibly can type scenario? Or is that a survival response where you're just primitively living? And your goal is to make money so that in the future there is a hope, and that's all that that person has, a hope that things will change. Both of those responses you can get. It's a thought process. So when the alarm goes off, person one wakes up and goes, shit, I got to get out of bed. I got to go to work. And so now they're trapped. They're in a survival response. They're essentially a slave to what's going on in their life. You have the person who has the same job, the same amount of money. The alarm goes off and they go, cool, I get to get out of bed and I get to improve the quality of my life today because I'm going to work. I get to earn money. I'm enjoying myself. I'm around good people. Or if not, I'm progressing in my life. And so based on the perception depends on how you feel about the day. And then as things happen to you throughout the day, you can take it as being a fear-based response, which is stress, worry, concern, anger, aggression. All of those things tend to be a fear-based response. They're a survival response. Or you can look at them as a self-actualization response, which is, cool, sometimes shit happens. It's all right. It's not that bad. We'll get over it. It's not the worst thing in the world that could happen. And then you keep moving through it and you learn the lessons that you need to learn. I was working with a business owner yesterday. Now, this guy has built a business from zero to, I think, about $5 or $8 million revenue in about 2 years. And he came to me because the business is just crazy. He has no management skills, very limited leadership skills, average communication skills. He doesn't know how to prioritize effectively, but he's a really hard worker. So he just grinds and puts in the hours and pushes himself. And so he's done great at that. The problem is he wakes up every morning living in fear. That fear is, what if I don't get the next job? What are staff going to do? Or we don't have enough work this month. We've only got this amount to get staff through. And so he's always in this fear-based response. Then when he goes to work, he has that same emotional state with staff when he's around staff. So they feel different. They feel his energy. Then most of the day he's tired, burnt out, lethargic. Mentally, he doesn't have a lot of energy. And then so when problems come in, he just tries to deal with what he can. So when a problem comes in, fucking hell, I got to deal with this shit again. Crap, why does all this crap happen? God, these guys are idiots. Don't they just get it? They're all fear-based responses. He's in survival mode. He's seeing all the stuff that's not working. He's seeing all the things that aren't happening around him. And by the way, when you do that, you create fantasies in your mind about the future. So when you're in a survival response, the more in survival you are, the more you fantasize about the future. And so this is why hope works for a lot of people. A lot of people who live in poverty, the only thing that they have is hope. They'll go and they'll pray, they'll meditate, they do whatever they have to do because the only way that they can figure out how to move forward in life is through just hope. And that's through a fantasy. You know, God will look after us, the universe will look after us, Mother Nature will look after us. If I'm just a good person, everything will work out. Maybe, but maybe that's not the most effective strategy if you want to crush it in life. So please understand that the more you're in a survival response, the more hope is the only solution. This is also why people who are broke tend to gamble more. Okay, so if you have a look at people who are wealthy, they gamble less as a percentage of income versus those who have less money. So I remember my grandparents struggled financially their whole lives. Yet every week they were 100% guaranteed to go down and buy a lotto ticket every week. And if there was a $100 million prize, they would buy a couple. They would squeeze that week to try and get more lotto tickets. Why? Because their only hope that they had was hope. So now, survival response, when you live like that, it puts you into a stress state. Now we have two types of stress. We have eustress and we have distress. Right now I'm recording this podcast. It is early in the morning. I've been awake since 5 o'clock this morning. Yesterday I worked from 4 a.m. My last call was a coaching call. I got off that call at 9:30 last night. Pretty long day. Went to bed. I spent like half an hour with Jess. Went to bed, woke up this morning. I was awake just before 4:30, got out of bed at 4:30 before my alarm went off. And I'm here doing this podcast, right? So it's 6:30 a.m. now and I've already done a bunch of stuff this morning. But what my point is that when you're living in survival mode, your energy drops because you're living in distress. And distress, when we look at what a distress is, it's an imbalance. So when someone says I have stress, they're normally talking about distress. The other stress is eustress. It's beneficial stress. It's things that help you to grow as a person. It's things that stretch you and compress you in order to grow. So yesterday, I had a lot of eustress. I had a lot of growth. So I have a long day. I'm doing a lot of stuff. I was highly productive, but I still had good energy and I'm awake today. Now, today I'm feeling a little bit more flat than what I was yesterday, but it's all right. I'll catch up on sleep. Maybe I might have a power nap this afternoon or something like that. I've got to head off interstate anyway today. I got a bunch of podcasts that I'm doing interstate, so I'm flying out, do them for a day or two and then fly back. But anyway, your eustress is your growth stress. Distress is anytime there is a mental and emotional imbalance that then creates mental and emotional chaos, which then creates a whole bunch of chaotic habits and chaotic behaviors or reactions. So again, a reactive person normally is living in fear because they're not proactively doing things, they're reacting to things. And most people react financially. They go, shit, I got to go to work because I'm broke. That's a reaction. Crap, doctor said I'm sick, I better look after my health. They're only going to do that until they're just out of distress and then they'll fuck it all up again. This is why people work hard from Monday to Friday. They do all the right things financially. The weekend comes and they blow all their cash. Or they look after their health and they go to their gym on Monday to Thursday. Friday comes, they forget to go to the gym. They party hard over the weekend. They destroy their health. That's because most people live in distress. And when you take away the distress, they think that everything's going okay and then they fuck it all up again. I would assume that most of you who are listening to this do exactly that in some area of life. You'll start doing well and then you'll self-sabotage. You'll self-destruct. You'll procrastinate. All of those things are part of a mindset of survival. When you thrive, you just wake up and you go, cool, I get to do cool shit today. Like I love doing podcasts and things like that because I know that it helps people. All I've got to do is with this podcast episode, I just got to help one person or make one person think different or trigger one person enough that they're so pissed off with me that they go and they think about this for the next 6 to 12 months. And even if they hate my guts, they're still thinking about it, but at least they're growing. So the more we live in eustress, the more we optimize growth. The more we live in distress, the more destructive we become mentally, emotionally, and physically in our lives. Now, some people can live in distress their whole life. Like my grandparents lived in financial distress their whole life. My grandparents lived in health distress most of their life because I would go over there and every week they'd gone to the doctors. Both of my grandparents had cancers. They were always getting shit cut off of their body or cut out of their body. They always had something going on. Okay, but they weren't healthy. They would eat for pleasure. They wouldn't eat for health. Now, when you're consistently seeking pleasure, you're doing so as a counterbalancer to the pain. There's a theory that humans are driven to seek pleasure and avoid pain. That is true if you live in survival. If you live in self-actualization, pleasure and pain are the same things. Doing this podcast isn't pleasurable, but it's not painful. It's just what I love to do. And what I love to do is a balance point. When you love your life, you do it because the things that you do help you to optimally grow as a person. So I do this podcast because it helps me to become a better speaker. I get to live my values. Financially, it stretches and compresses me because I know I get more clients. When I get more clients, I make more money, but it compresses me at the same time because I've got more workload. I have more expectations. All of those things happen because I do this thing that I enjoy. Going to the gym is exactly the same. I don't sit there and think, fuck, gym session, this is the most pleasurable thing I'm going to do today. What normally happens is I go, I'm going to the gym because I love training. And when I love training, I have compression, okay? Because when I'm lifting the weights, it sucks. When I'm up to 11 reps and I got to get out 12 to 15 and my muscles are burning, I still keep going. I've got to push that little bit more. So you have that compression and the expansion at the same time that help you to grow as a person. If I didn't go to the gym, that would probably be way more pleasurable, but eventually it leads back to the pain. And so people who move away from pain towards pleasure end up back in pain, seeking pleasure again. And so this becomes their whole life. Most people, when they get paid, it's pleasurable. Then they end up back in financial pain because they spend it all by seeking pleasure. People who have problems with alcohol and drugs and alcohol are pleasurable, but then it leads them back to pain. When they're in pain, they seek drugs and alcohol again, and it creates a vicious cycle. So I believe that the reason why the psychology industry and the mental health industry and also the coaching industry keeps talking about this pleasure and pain model, that humans are driven to move away from pain, which is true. Most humans are, depending on how they self-actualize. The majority of the population, 8 billion people on the planet, naturally move away from pain and they move towards pleasure. So that there is a 100% credible theory. But there is a bunch of individuals who take pleasure and pain together, and they're the ones who self-actualize. When you look at Elon Musk, the guy's the richest person on the planet. Why does he wake up every day and still work? Why? Because he's self-actualizing. He cares more about his own personal growth and leaving a legacy than what he does, how he feels in the moment. Whereas the average person will never leave a legacy. They care more about the pleasure that they're seeking and the pain that they're avoiding. And because of that, it just creates feedback loops. So now when it comes to anxiety, I believe that anxiety is a fear-based response when adrenaline spikes, which normally happens through fear. So when we spike our adrenaline and we're in some form of mental distress based on a perception, then we tend to trigger anxiety, especially when there's a time frame involved. So I'll give you an example. If you're sitting in traffic, you have an hour to get to a meeting. It takes you 45 minutes to get there. You've already looked at Google Maps or whatever, and it says 45 minutes, and you go, okay, excellent. So you hop in the car and you start driving. Now you're about 30 minutes into the trip. So you're 15 minutes away. But now all of a sudden there's a car accident and you're sitting stuck in traffic, and you look out of your window and for a whole kilometer, all you can see is cars, bumper to bumper. Traffic is moving about 1 car length every 3 minutes. And you're sitting there looking at your watch going, shit, I'm going to be late for the meeting. The moment that your brain triggers and goes, I'm going to be late, that moment is the moment that adrenaline spikes. That adrenaline spike now starts to create this anxiety. It's an overstimulation of your cells. That's where you feel anxiety. So when I have people who come to me and they say, I've been diagnosed with anxiety or I have these anxiety disorders, it's normally a time-related response to something, to a stress or a fear. I'll give you another example. I worked with a client years ago, and she came to me because she was diagnosed with social anxiety. When I sat down with her, I said, okay, tell me about what's going on. And she said, well, I've got this social anxiety. I don't like going out in public. I'm an introvert, and all these stupid labels, because in this day and age, everyone's given these fucking labels that they play around with. I said, okay, cool. By the way, introvert and extrovert has everything to do with values and nothing to do with whether you like going out in public or not. Everyone is extroverted when they live their values, and everyone introverts when they're outside of their values. I introvert around certain groups of people. I extrovert around certain groups of people. It all depends. It depends on your values. I dive more into that on some of the podcasts that I've done around values. So anyway, let's get back to it. She sits down and she says, I can't go out in public so much because I get triggered and I don't like being around a lot of people and yada, yada, yada. So she gives me this whole story and I said, look, go to a moment where it happened. Now, again, this is the reason why most coaches and most people in the mental health industry and in those different therapies fail. And they fail because they don't go to moments, they allow people to generalize. Now, if you ask someone how their day is, that's a generalization. They'll say good. But there could be problems that happen during that day. They just don't acknowledge them. You ask them how their day is and they say that it's shit. That's a generalization. You're taking a whole day, right? Every second of that day, and you're generalizing it into one quick statement. When someone says it's a shit day, they're not looking at all the good things that are going on. They're just looking at a couple of bad things that have triggered them to label that whole day as bad. So people tend to get labeled because they generalize, and therapists allow them to do that, which I think is unacceptable and unexcusable. But this is also the reason why I guess I'm one of the top coaches on the planet. If you get someone to go to the moment, which is what I did with this woman, I said, look, go to the moment where you were triggered. Now, it took a little while. She ended up going back to the moment. She said, I remember being at a family function. And she said, look, I was there and I started to get the social anxiety. And I said, what happened? And she said, well, mum said, look, it's just a family function. It'll be okay. It's not that big a deal. We'll just ride it out for a couple of hours and you'll be fine. And I said, well, what was the time pressure? And she said, there was no time pressure. It wasn't like I was in a rush to get anywhere. And I said, okay, that's fair enough. But I kept digging and asking her questions. Eventually, when I put pressure on her and said there had to be a time pressure there, where was it? She eventually cracked and she said, Michael, all I wanted to do was to get the fuck out of there. The time pressure was that she didn't have a high value on family. And because of that, she was being made to socialize with a whole bunch of people that she didn't really want to hang around because she's completely different than most of her family. So when she hangs out there, she's got a perception in her brain that I don't want to be here. She then creates a story in her brain about not wanting to be there, and it reinforces itself, so it loops. It does something called ruminate. And rumination means where you have the same thoughts over and over and over again. The more she thought about not wanting to be there, the more it triggered this anxiety and made her stressed. The more she stressed about it, the more anxious she became, and that's what triggered her social anxiety. When we went to times where she liked hanging out with certain friends, she didn't have any problem socializing. So she could go to things like Comic-Con or stuff like that with a whole bunch of people who are like her, and she was completely extroverted and she was fine. But in environments where she didn't want to be, she would then end up with this social anxiety. That's all it was. When I showed her that, she's like, oh shit, so if I just keep hanging out with people that I enjoy and I don't do everything for everybody else, like go to functions that I don't want to go to, then I should be fine. I said, yeah, that's like most people. If I have to hang around a whole bunch of goobers that I don't want to hang around with, I end up feeling stressed out as well and anxious because I don't want to be there. I would rather do other things. This is why at my events, I say to people, if I don't want to do something, I just don't do it. And people always put up their hand. They say, yeah, but what about like family and stuff like that? And I say, I just don't do it. And they go, yeah, but you have to. They're family. And I'm like, no, you have to. I don't have to. I live my own life. I'm not a people pleaser. My family get the best of me when I'm at family functions. They don't get an average me who doesn't want to be there, who's trying to avoid it, but I'm trying to people please my parents or other people around me. Because they're only getting part of you. They're not getting the whole you. And then they're like, oh, really? Do you really do that? Jess is normally at the back of the room. And I say, Jess, if I don't want to go to a family function, what do I do? And Jess looks and smiles at everyone. And she says, he just doesn't go. And I say, it happens all the time. Jess will go up and see her family. They live up in the country. And she'll say, do you want to come up and see my parents this weekend? We're going out for lunch. And I say, look, I got too much work on. I'd just rather work. And she goes, yeah, okay. How did I get to that position though? First of all, I got clarity with my values. I created my success map in life. I learned how to communicate effectively with people so they don't feel left out. I communicate with my family and tell them this is how I work. This is why I do what I do. This is why it's meaningful to me. Now, the majority of the time, my family understand that because I was able to communicate it with them. Every now and again, they have a problem. It's normally my mum. My mum has a problem with that sometimes. Then what I have to do is just remind her of it. And I ask her questions. I don't tell her, I ask her questions. I say, Mum, what do you want from me? My mum says, well, I want you to be happy. And I say, look, what do you think makes me happy? She says, doing what you're doing. And I say, exactly. So if you want me to be happy, me doing what I'm doing means that you're a good mum. It means that the family gets everything that they want, which is me to succeed and enjoy my life. Then she understands again. And then I just go about my week, my month, or my day. Now, I love hanging out with family, but I probably catch up with my parents maybe once a month. Actually, it's March the 12th. I haven't seen my family since Christmas Day. So it's 2 and a bit months. But I talk to them almost every week. So my suggestion is, if you're getting anxiety, you need to figure out what the fear response is. You also need to figure out why it's being triggered. And then you have to figure out why you're creating time frames around that. What are you trying to get away from and why? Then eventually you'll figure out that you can control that anxiety. So anyway, Driven Mofos, I hope that helps. Look, I dive bomb way into these topics a lot more in my Thrive Time event. So if you're having anxiety, social anxiety, stuff like that, and you want to crack those patterns, come to Thrive Time where I can work with you more one-on-one. Now, if I can't, I'll refer you to the right people. Almost everyone I've ever spoken to, I can normally crack that pattern. It just takes a little bit of time to work through it, hence why I say the Thrive Time event. But also it helps you to build your success map in life so you know why you do what you do. You're able to explain it more to people because you have more clarity. You understand your value system and why prioritizing your time around your values is important to you. Because if you live outside of your values for long enough and you become a people pleaser, you'll probably have more anxiety, more depressed, more frustrated, and more emotional triggers because you'll live in a more primitive mental and emotional response instead of self-actualizing. Thrive Time is all about self-actualizing and moving up that life chain where you get to live the life that you want. Anyway, Driven Mofos, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please remember to rate and review this podcast if you haven't already done so. And I look forward to answering the next question on the next podcast. See you then. Most people waste their life, and I just don't want you to be one of them.